Okay, so this is part three of our series on propaganda. We've talked about its necessity, why it exists, its nature, uh, how it works, sort of some characteristics of the theory, the social um, aspects of our society that it exploits. And so now we're going to talk about its history. So how it has worked to establish itself, its origins, um, in uh, economy and government, institutionalized. So we're going to go over to that section now, and we're about halfway. I think there will be this video and then probably one more. So you've reached the halfway point. So it's history. We can kind of start. I said that this is that propaganda is a characteristically modern phenomenon, and if we, it's kind of arbitrary, but if we choose uh, Freud as our starting point, um, maybe not the most accurate beginning as far as when these things were beginning to be exploited. It might go back, even earlier to the Enlightenment, when populations were being manipulated with ideology in a way that had never happened before, appeals to popular sentiments. But as far as a very specific strategic implementation of these ideas for conscious control over large populations, we can with some degree of accuracy choose Freud. And if you know anything about Freud, he studied his emphasis was on how much those impulses that we are not conscious of, the unconscious parts of ourselves, and how much that drives the decisions we make. And he sort of pulled back the curtain on how many of our decisions, or at least how much of the weight that is behind our decisions, is not really rational. We sort of give and I'm not a Freudian by any means, but um, basically he was correct in a lot of ways by saying that we tend to put a rational or a logical veneer, a logical wrapping paper around our decisions to make them look like we thought them through, when in actuality we're expressing an impulse, or in his terms, a drive, usually a sexual drive. And that's why you will find in some of these techniques an appeal to sensuality or sexuality, erotic undertones, things like that. So where this moves into, Freud wasn't an advertising man, but he had a nephew in the United States, and his name was Edward Bernays. So uh, we can take sort of the genealogy of these ideas, the type of human being or the vision of man that is ripe for exploitation via propaganda. That type of man was described by Freud. Edward Bernays was the first one to start systematically exploiting that for economic, political goals. Okay, so Bernays is the pioneer of propaganda. Um, and of course, he worked um, with Woodrow Wilson during the war, and helped to formulate slogans such as "making the world safe for democracy," things along those lines. So he was involved in war, but his real pioneering work came during peacetime. And here's a video of Bernays talking a little bit about his work. It might be the only video, and he is very, very old.
When I came back to the United States, I decided that if you could use propaganda for war, you could certainly use it for peace. And propaganda got to be a bad word because of the Germans. using it. So what I did was to try to find some other words. So we found the word Council on Public Relations.
So I'm not sure how well you could hear that, but after the war, propaganda was, a pejorative term. And so he had to find something else to call it. He called it public relations. And that's why at the very beginning of this presentation, I was talking about how propaganda is not this this caricatured thing, Uncle Sam, I want you, all of this obvious type of manipulation. It's something omnipresent. And that's what I'm talking about is he admits openly that he took all of the concepts and the strategies of war propaganda, but stopped calling it that because you can't call it that. People wouldn't like that very much, and started selling his services under the name of a council on public relations. And we now every company has public relations, PR. I mean, that's what PR stands for. And so he invented the profession of public relations, which is basically the implementation of a propagandist for hire for both government and for business in peacetime. So, how did he utilize propaganda technique, Freudian theory in peacetime for various interested groups? So again, birth of public relations. He would do things like celebrity marketing. Today we would call this influencer marketing, where a company goes and gets some famous person to plug their product. He invented that. Product placement in movies or in certain contexts, having someone drink a Pepsi, just that kind of visual messaging. Focus groups, that was his idea. Bringing in if you're trying to sell a new cooking product, bringing in some housewives and having them express their feelings and thoughts and responses to different colors and shapes and slogans and see what gets the best response. And so here I'm going to show you a video of him with kind of it looks primitive to us, but you can pick up on the type of mentality that is trying to be instilled by this type of, quote, marketing, which is that, things like clothes aren't because you need something to wear, something that is functional and durable, but for various other reasons that is now common to us, but what is being addressed here would have been somewhat revolutionary.
There's a psychology of dress. Have you ever thought about it? How it can express your character? You all have interesting characters, but some of them are all hidden. I wonder why you all want to dress always the same, with the same hats and the same coats. I'm sure all of you are interesting and have wonderful things about you, but looking at you in the street, you all look so much the same. And that's why I'm talking to you about the psychology of dress. Try and express yourselves better in your dress.
Okay, so you probably caught in there what we call the repetition of keywords, and how many times she said interesting and same and interesting and same. And she's obviously appealing to a demographic who cares, who wants to be interesting. And so naturally, the worst thing that could happen is that you could look just like everybody else. It's a kind of teaching. And so clothes are here now the way that you should express yourself. And we still see the work of Bernays in when they talk about school uniforms, which would have been not really problematic for generations. And now if someone suggests school uniforms, it's, oh, you're stifling their expression. How could they possibly express themselves if they all look the same? As if personality and speech don't exist. So again, that's the pioneering work of Bernays, selling clothes. He also did things, very, very creative things, like creating contests or creating trends. This is kind of like the viral thing today, that if you can make something go viral, even if it doesn't really have anything to do with the use of your product. And one example is for Ivory soap. And they created the Ivory soap carving contest. And I'm really too young to remember anything about that, but my parents do remember. And it'd be a contest where you took a bar of soap and you tried to carve something, and I guess it was pretty big for a while. But think about that. If you sell Ivory soap and you've created this nationwide craze or fad or contest where everybody's going out and buying soap so they can basically destroy it, or at least go through it much faster. You're convincing someone to buy your product and cut it up for reasons completely extraneous to what your product actually does. It's genius. But you could sell so many extra products that way. So that's Bernays. And I mentioned earlier the sexualization of the automobile. There's a video here, and it's kind of hilarious.
It seems so much longer than last year.
It is. Nearly 4 inches longer in some models.
Oh.
Nearly 4 inches longer in some models. So, again, not subtle at all, but instead of buying a vehicle because you need the vehicle, you should also use it as a way to, send these signals, these sexual signals, which is, as Freud taught, extremely powerful when it comes to decision making. So if your car is sexier than the other car, then of course it's going to sell better. And so you see all of that kind of marketing. So did they succeed? To what degree did he succeed in getting us to treat vehicles as sort of sexual symbols? And this is something that I used to see all the time, and I don't see it anymore. But the testicles on the back of a truck, it's absurd, but it just shows the success of Freud. And here we've got magnificent symbol of a propagandized brain. So it's not only, this is a car with testicles, but it's also testicles with the American flag. So all sorts of, you could spend a week unpacking all of that. So anyway, Bernays, hugely successful, implementing techniques that are still used today and that we take as commonplace. So he was working with Wilson, earlier on, but eventually World War II came, and you had Germany. And so remember when Bernays was talking about this, he talked about the Germans using it, but the Germans used a lot of American technique to learn from. So in a sense, their propaganda technique, they were the students of the United States. And so we talked about how propaganda serves various needs, serves the individual and state need. So think about World War II. Was there a hero for Germany? Yes, of course. Was there a scapegoat? And did this involve self-justification, shifting of moral blame, and unification of population for political goals, the need for religion and political parties, the role political parties play in that, and in giving everyone what they need, serving all of their goals? It's a perfect example. Corporate need. There's the example of Lucky Strike cigarettes with their focus groups and changing the color of their packaging for what is, most pleasing during wartime, and product placement, Lucky Strikes in movies, references to Lucky Strikes, to where Lucky Strikes were like the only cigarette, that existed during World War II. So sometimes, again, all parties will collude in expressions of propaganda that are obvious once you know what you're looking for. Remember, after 9/11, there was, I think, French resistance to what the United States was doing. And so this seems so absurdly childish, but we stopped calling French fries and started calling them freedom fries to, I don't know, show disdain for all things French. Um, but that was actually a thing, and I actually heard people calling them that. And so, again, that's McDonald's capitalizing on the need to sell fries, the United States capitalizing on the need to get people to support its policies, and people getting to feel the need to participate all through eating some greasy junk food. There's a side topic just because it's interesting and because it's a big part of some of these. Bernays used women in his propaganda a lot. And so I just wanted to offer a few examples of the changes towards the role of women, the view of women. And obviously, we've all seen these war propaganda posters, women being urged to come out of the home, to do the job he left behind, women's empowerment. Feminism, of course, that's wonderful for the economy. The more labor, the more the GDP can grow. You can create the whole industry of daycare. There's Betty Crocker. And this is a neat little case in point. What was happening is cake in a box was being developed, which was, made, if you've ever, made a cake from scratch versus making a cake from a box, which very few people probably have made one from scratch anymore. It's much easier. But for some reason, women weren't buying the cake in a box. And based on Freudian psychology, what they took to be the cause of that is they felt guilty. And it had nothing to do with the taste or ease of use of the product. It was guilt that they weren't cooking for their men anymore.
In other words, he understood that the barrier to the consumption of the product was the housewife's feeling of guilt about using it. They basically, on one hand, wanted to make it easy for themselves, but they felt guilty about it. So what you've got to do in those circumstances is remove the barrier being guilt. The way you do that is to give the housewife a greater sense of participation.
And how do you do that?
By adding an egg.
Simple as that.
As simple as that.
So if you ever wondered why you have to add an egg into a boxed cake or other recipes that you're making, it is completely unnecessary in the sense that you could have powdered protein in there, something along those lines. But it's there because they weren't selling otherwise. And that little tiny act gave women who wanted to feel like they were contributing something meaningful to the process enough of a feeling of that they were able to sell the product. So it made the difference. There's also the tobacco taboo. Women, shouldn't smoke. And what Bernays did was staged a PR event where at a national parade or a very large parade, they got lots of media coverage. He had a group of suffragettes at a particular moment that was, where cameras would be present and reporters hide cigarettes underneath their dresses, and then at a particular moment they would pull them out and smoke them and in full view as a huge symbolic moment and break the taboo on women smoking. And of course, the obvious benefactor would be tobacco companies. And just once that taboo was broken, they doubled their consumer base. So that is the end of part 3. And what I'm going to end with in the final installment is a case study that sort of ties it all together and tells a pretty interesting story about that involves the CIA, the government, corporations, public sentiments, and foreign policy.